On the afternoon of May 9, 2012, whilst demonstrating the recently developed Sukhoi 100 Superjet to a group of potential new customers, two highly experienced test pilots inadvertently flew their aircraft into the summit of a 7,200-foot volcanic peak to the south of Jakarta in Indonesia. Of the 45 souls on board, none survived. What follows is a detailed account of how human fallibility, procedural indifference, and compromised oversight conspired to destroy not only the lives of those on board, but also the reputation of Russia's rising aviation star. This is the complete story of the Mt.Salak tragedy. In May of 2000, the Sukhoi Aircraft Company embarked on a project to design, produce and deliver an all-new commercial airliner, the first such endeavour since the collapse of the old Soviet bloc. Despite being more synonymous with the military market, Sukhoi's research nonetheless identified what they believed was a commercial demand within Russia itself for an aircraft which could provide for ranges of 3,000 to 4,500 kilometres. That's the equivalent of 1,900 to 2,800 miles. Performance somewhat less than currently available from the medium-haul fleet of the day, but better than the existing fleet of regional jets. Initially, 3 variants were envisaged, with 60, 78 and 98 seats respectively, all being configured in a 5-abreast layout, deemed the most economical for an aircraft of its size. Sukhoi's figures had identified a target market of between 250 and 300 aircraft within Russia itself and the extended Commonwealth of Independent States, with what they believed was a further potential for another 500 to 600 sales internationally. Just over a year later, in October 2001, the Russian government entered the fray with an allocation of nearly $47 million towards the development of a new 70 to 80-seater regional jet. Despite this tender attracting the attention of a number of interested domestic parties, it was ultimately Sukhoi's project which was chosen for further development in March of 2003. As the project now gained momentum, in October of the same year, Sukhoi entered into a number of supply agreements with established and well-respected players in the international aviation market. The French giant Thales was contracted to provide the aircraft's suite of avionics. Their counterparts, Safran, were to develop and supply the aircraft's landing gear and fuel systems, while US giant Honeywell was to provide the auxiliary power unit. Swiss manufacturer Liebherr was awarded contracts for the aircraft's flight controls, with additional US company Parker Hannifin and BE Aerospace being responsible for hydraulics and cabin interior. Now, over 5 years on from the initial concept, Sukhoi were to establish a modern, state-of-the-art production line at Komsomolsk-on-Amur in Russia's Far East. Plans for the initial 60 and 78-seater versions were ultimately shelved, with both being deemed less cost-effective than the larger 98-seat derivative. With production now totally focused on the Seoul model, it was rebranded the new Sukhoi Superjet 100 at the Farnborough Air Show in the UK in July 2005, with the first order being placed by Aeroflot for 30 aircraft on the 7th of December of the same year. Sukhoi's policy of subcontracting international players in the jet's manufacture was enhanced still further in June 2007, with Boeing being brought on board to provide assistance with flight and maintenance crew training, aircraft manuals, and the supply and management of spare parts. Initial ground tests of the airframe were commenced in January 2007, with the type's new engine ready for testing almost a year later in February 2008. This testing schedule culminated in the Superjet's maiden flight on May 19, 2008, with the second aircraft following some months later in late December. By January 2009, these first 2 aircraft had completed over 80 flights, with the engines having completed over 2,300 hours of testing. In April of that year, the 2 prototypes were flown 3,000 kilometers, the equivalent of 1,600 miles, from Novosibirsk to Moscow, where pilots from EASA, the European Regulatory Authority, conducted a number of familiarity flights, in the hope that, having secured type certification from the Russian authorities, European certification would follow shortly thereafter. With the project now moving at a pace, the aircraft was to make its first international debut at the Paris Air Show that year, where Malev, the Hungarian international airline, placed a $1 billion order for 30 aircraft. As of June 2009, 13 aircraft were under construction, with the first 4 being scheduled for delivery from December. The Armenian national carrier Amavia was to receive the first 2, followed by the first of the 30 aircraft destined for Aeroflot. The expectation was that production would ramp up to reach 70 aircraft per year by 2012. However, despite this intended delivery schedule, all was to come to a sudden halt in December 2009, due not in any way to production shortcomings at Sukhoi itself, but rather at the French engine manufacturer Sonekma and their Russian counterpart Saturn. By June 2010, the certification process had fallen slightly behind schedule, with the aforementioned engine supply issues impacting negatively. Finally, with these problems overcome, the Russian authorities granted type certification for the Sukhoi Superjet 100 on February 3, 2011, with the ASA's certification coming a year later in February 2012, allowing the aircraft to fly in European airspace. In the months that followed, Sukhoi embarked on a number of promotional tours aimed at attracting potential new buyers. One such tour, the Welcome Asia Tour, had initially commenced in Kazakhstan, but as the roadshow moved on to Pakistan, technical problems had plagued the display aircraft, ultimately resulting in it being temporarily grounded. An embarrassing turn of events, which was to deny any potential clients an opportunity to see the Superjet take to the skies. Having overcome their problems, while en route to Naypyidaw in Myanmar, the aircraft suffered additional engine problems, ultimately being substituted for a replacement aircraft flown in from Moscow, registered as 97004, the very same aircraft which would ultimately impact the steep slopes of Mt.Salak in Indonesia just 2 days later. The intended display flight in Myanmar was completed as scheduled on May 7th. The following day, May 8th, the aircraft was positioned from Naypyidaw to Jakarta, arriving in the Indonesian capital at 15:50 local that afternoon. Followed by a rest period of nearly 18.5 hours at 11:43 local on the morning of May 9th, the Sukhoi demonstration crew undertook the first of 2 scheduled display flights from the city's Halim Perdanakusuma International Airport. Located some 12 kilometres or 7.5 miles from Jakarta city centre, Halim serves as its secondary airport. Although designated an international airport, it primarily handles domestic VIP and non-commercial flights, including numerous military movements, with the airport being home to 5 active squadrons of the Indonesian Air Force. With a single runway orientated northeast-southwest of 3,000 metres, just over 9,800 feet in length, the topography of the surrounding area is relatively flat to the north, east and west, with the terrain rising quickly approximately 45 kilometres or 30 miles to the south. In this direction, Mt.Salak, at 7,253 feet, is flanked by the twin peaks of Mount Pangrango at approximately 9,900 feet to the east and Mount Halimund at 6,300 feet to the west, with this terrain ridge to play a crucial part in the events of that later afternoon, May 9th, 2012. Airspace in the immediate area was controlled from the tower at Halim, out to a distance of 12 nautical miles in all directions, and from ground level up to 3,500 feet. Beyond this, Jakarta arrival covered an area of radius 30 nautical miles from the previous ceiling of 3,500 up to 7,000 feet, with a further control area above this still, extending up to 15,000 feet and out to 75 nautical miles. This latter control area being divided into Jakarta West and East Control respectively, with this East Control area encompassing the Atang Sanjaya Military Training Area, more commonly referred to as the Bogor Area, a restricted airspace of rectangular shape extending from ground level to an altitude of 6,000 feet above sea level, with the existence of this training area being hugely relevant to the subsequent later events of that afternoon. The aircraft's first demonstration flight had departed to the southwest from Halim's runway 24 at 11:43 local, the jet subsequently landing some 22 minutes later after an uneventful flight at 12:05. Although the crew would most probably have expected a carbon copy rerun for the aircraft's second display, and in all likelihood were predisposed to that fact, a slight change in wind direction meant that events second time round would be subtly but significantly different. As the crew readied themselves for the second flight of the day, in command was Captain Alexander Yablensky, aged 57. To say Yablentsev was an accomplished aviator would have been something of an understatement. With nearly 10,500 hours of total experience under his belt, the near 1,500 hours or so he had accumulated on the Sukhoi 100 alone made him one of the most experienced pilots anywhere on the new type. Indeed, in his capacity as lead Sukhoi test pilot, he had personally taken charge of the aircraft's very first flight 4 years earlier in 2008. An accomplished Russian combat pilot and cosmonaut, while fulfilling his duties at Sukhoi, Yablentsev had personally commanded 9 specific test flights, which centred on certifying the aircraft's terrain awareness and warning system, more commonly referred to by the acronym TAWS. Ironically, this being the case, his in-depth knowledge and familiarity of this system in particular would make explanation of the events which were to shortly follow all the more difficult. Accompanying him on the flight deck that morning was fellow test pilot 44-year-old Alexander Kochikov. His total time had extended to just over 3,000 hours, 625 of which had been logged on the Sukhoi 100. Uncharacteristically, given the nature of these demonstration flights, the crew complement that day was extended to a third member, that being a navigator whose responsibilities were to mitigate the crew's workload given their collective unfamiliarity with the environment they were flying in. On the day in question, this role was being fulfilled by 51-year-old Oleg Shevetsov, who himself had gained over 3,500 hours of total flight experience, just under 500 hours of which had been amassed as a result of his involvement with the Sukhoi 100 test program. In addition to the 2 pilots on board were 2 cabin crew members and 41 passengers who consisted of 4 additional Sukhoi personnel, including Shevetsov, 1 representative of the engine manufacturer Senekma, and 36 invited guests from both the media and a collection of potential airline customers, one of whom was to occupy the vacant jump seat in the cockpit. With the surface wind now favouring runway 06, the second planned display flight would now depart to the northeast, in the opposite direction to the first. The plan after departure was to turn right onto a more southerly track, establishing outbound on the 200-degree radial from the Helm via War navigation beacon, whilst all the time climbing to an altitude of 10,000 feet. But there was a catch, a subtle but ultimately significant difference between Yablentsev's understanding of the aircraft's intended routing and that of the air traffic control personnel on duty in Jakarta. Following their first departure off of runway 24 to the southwest, they had likewise turned to establish on the 200-degree radial from the Helm beacon, but had proceeded no further than 20 nautical miles in that direction, to an area just short of the previously mentioned terrain ridge called Bogor, essentially a suburb to the south of the city. In or around that general area, they had then turned left and headed back to the north in order to make an approach and landing back onto the same runway from which they had departed only minutes beforehand. With regard to their second flight, however, while attempting to file a flight plan for it, with the intention of effectively retracing their earlier routing along the 200-degree radial to a distance of 20 nautical miles, the request was this time denied. The reason for the plan being rejected was due to the fact that the change in wind direction had also resulted in a similar runway change at the nearby and much busier Jakarta International, and as a result, ATC were now concerned that the proposed routing would conflict with its revised traffic flow pattern. As such, although the Sukhoi would still be cleared to navigate south along the 200-degree radial, ATC wanted Yablentsev to instead route to Pelabuhan Ratu, a point located on the 200-degree radial but at a distance of 50 nautical miles, rather than the previous point overhead Bogor at just 20. This critical piece of information, however, appears not to have been communicated back to Yablentsev by the ground handling personnel who were responsible for filing the flight plan in the first instance, meaning that his understanding of what they were intending to do was different to what had been actually approved. Unbeknownst to Yablentsev and his crew was the fact that a number of additional critical oversights were now all starting to align in the background. Oversights which collectively were now beginning to conspire to work against the Russian crew, leading them down a path to their own ultimate demise. The first, unbelievably, was the fact that none of the local navigation charts carried on board the Sukhoi depicted either the topography which existed to the south of the airport, nor the presence of the Atang Sanjaya military training area. Secondly, as the Sukhoi 100 was a brand new type. When the flight plan had been uploaded into the air traffic control system, the software in use at the time was unable to identify the aircraft for what it was, a civil commercial airliner. As such, a manual input of the flight's details had to be made, in which the aircraft's type had been assigned not as a Sukhoi 100, but rather a Sukhoi 30, high-performance military jet fighter, which at the time was routinely stationed at Halim International and used by the Indonesian Air Force. Thirdly, the MSA, or Minimum Safe Altitude Warning System, available to the controllers on duty in Jakarta, which had been designed to assist with the prevention of CFIT, or controlled flight into terrain accidents, was found to be ineffective, specifically by generating in a timely manner a warning of possible aircraft infringements of defined minimum safe altitudes. Incredibly, despite the presence of significant terrain to the south of the airport, minimum altitudes had not been stipulated for this sector, and as such, potential terrain conflicts could occur without any associated warnings being generated at the controller's station. And finally, from a human factors perspective, was the significant workload being experienced by controllers on duty in Jakarta on the morning in question. Recordings clearly showed that at the time of the accident there had been an intensive, almost continuous exchange of communication between the area controller concerned and the 13 aircraft under her supervision. With this volume of traffic and the acute under-resourcing being experienced at the facility, leaving many of the controllers feeling, in their own words, simply overloaded. At 14:05, Kochikov requested and was subsequently given permission to start engines. With the after-start checklist complete, the Sukhoi was further cleared to taxi, this time to runway 06, 9 minutes later. As Yablentsev taxied the Sukhoi for departure, the tower controller issued him with the clearance to initially climb straight ahead on runway heading. On passing 2000, he was to turn right to establish on the 200-degree radial from the Halim VOR navigation beacon, while continuing his climb to level off and maintain 10,000 feet. Kochikov acknowledged the clearance, with the tower controller further clearing them to take off immediately thereafter. As Yablentsev climbed the Sukhoi into the broken cloud cover above, the tower controller finally handed the flight off to the Jakarta East sector. Given the fact that the aircraft was all but empty, by the time Kochikov got a chance to get a word in edgeways on the frequency, the Sukhoi was already level at 10,000 feet and established on the 200-degree radial. Having been identified by the Jakarta East controller, it was about now that the implications of the previous miscommunication between the dispatcher and Yablentsev began to play out. Having flown the first demonstration flight along the 200-degree radial to a distance of 20 nautical miles, Yablentsev was of the belief that that is what they were doing again, second time round, being unaware of the revised requirement to go that extra bit further, out to 50. As a rule of thumb, such transport aircraft require a distance of approximately 3 times their height in zero wind conditions, in order to lose that height and make a satisfactory approach in landing. Given that Halim International was more or less situated at sea level, from 10,000 feet, Yablentsev knew that the Sukhoi would need about 30 miles in order to descend and land. But given that his belief was that they weren't to proceed any further than 20 nautical miles south of the field, his perception was that they were high and needed to descend immediately if they were to stand any chance of making a successful landing back onto runway 06. Turning to Kochikov in the right-hand seat, Yablentsev asked him to coordinate with the East controller for an immediate descent clearance back down to 6,000 feet initially. Possibly indicative of the fact that the controller was somewhat surprised by the request, given the terrain that she knew was in the area, she asked Kochikov to repeat himself. When Kochikov did so, the controller obliged and issued the descent clearance which Yablentsev was looking for, despite the fact that it would take the aircraft below the minimum sector altitude or MSA for the area. In order to fully understand the implications of what's just happened, it would be helpful to have a thorough understanding of terrain separation rules as they pertain to instrument flying. While operating in a radar environment, the controller, whilst providing radar vectors to an aircraft, is responsible for ensuring that adequate terrain separation is being provided. In circumstances where this radar service is unavailable or simply not being provided for whatever reason, the pilot instead must follow published procedures, which specifically define minimum altitudes at each point along their route, adherence to which will ensure an alternative method of guaranteeing this same terrain separation. The important takeaway here is the concept of published procedures, where each individual segment is uniquely swept in order to provide adequate clearance above the terrain immediately below. Any deviation away from or non-adherence to such published procedures will immediately place the aircraft in a precarious situation. In a non-radar environment, if not following these published procedures, there is, by definition, no way of guaranteeing that this adequate terrain separation is being maintained. Unless, that is, the aircraft is held at an altitude equivalent to or greater than the area's minimum sector altitude, or MSA. As the name suggests, the MSA defines a minimum altitude, which will provide a separation of 1,000 feet above all obstacles and terrain within a defined sector of a circle with radius of 25 nautical miles. This radius being centred on a defined reference point, typically a specific navigation beacon or airport. Beyond this 25 nautical mile radius, the same principle applies, but instead relates to a much larger surface area, defined geographically by a latitude and longitudinal grid, with this applicable grid south of the airport stipulating a much higher minimum altitude of 13,200 feet. Specifically, in relation to the Sukhoi's demonstration flight, Yablontseev's decision to self-position the aircraft along the 200-degree radial south from the Helm navigation beacon was a completely subjective one on his part, and as such complied with none of the area's published procedures. Mindful of what's just been said, therefore, this by definition meant that adequate terrain separation could only have been assured along this chosen routing if Yablontsev was to have maintained the MSA, which for this sector was defined as 6,900 feet above mean sea level. At about this time, the CVR picked up Kortchukov's comments relating to dark clouds up ahead. Thus, having requested a means, subsequently granted a descent clearance to 6,000 feet, without apparently having visual contact with the terrain ahead of him. Yablontsev had, either by accident or design, commenced a descent from 10,000 feet, which would ultimately compromise the safety of his aircraft and all those on board. Conscious of the fact that he was still way too high to allow for a straight-in approach to runway 06, Yablontsev further requested and was approved to conduct a right-hand orbit during the descent, in an effort to lose this excessive height. As a result, over the next 90 seconds or so, Yablontsev made 5 separate and successive adjustments to the aircraft's heading selector, in an effort to force the aircraft into a complete 360-degree turn to the right, during which time the aircraft levelled at 6,000, as it rolled through a more northwesterly heading, approximately 25 nautical miles from the Helm VOR navigation beacon. With the Sukhoi's close proximity to the restricted airspace of the military training area, as the orbit continued, a predictable airspace conflict alert was generated at the controller's station. In contrast, however, no similar alert was ever raised in relation to the aircraft's proximity to the adjacent terrain. The aircraft, in maintaining 6,000 feet, was now 900 feet below the MSA for the sector, an already compromising terrain clearance for the area. But as the turn continued, this situation would only become more and more precarious. At best, Kortchukov noted that he could only occasionally see the ground through breaks in the cloud layer below. Thus, in not having any visual contact with the terrain ahead of him, and following no published procedures which would allow for a safe descent path, Yablontsev had no clear picture of where he was in relation to the rising terrain ahead. But how had the Jakarta East controller approved such a clearance to descend below the MSA, knowing as she did that Yablontsev was not following any published procedure? Surely she, with her superior local knowledge, was aware of the terrain ahead, Had she descended the aircraft on a radar heading, this would have certainly mitigated the danger. But in sanctioning a descending orbit to the right, she really had no idea of what track the aircraft was actually going to take over the ground. And given its proximity to the terrain, was there a question of negligence on her part? In her subsequent post-accident interview, the controller stated that being extremely busy at the time, when the crew of the Sukhoi had requested descent to 6,000 feet, given the fact that the information available to her erroneously identified the aircraft as an Indonesian Air Force Sukhoi 30 fighter jet, and given its close proximity to Atang Sanjaya, she had assumed that the aircraft was on a test flight and descending visually to establish itself in the military training area, as was pretty normal practice for the time. Apparently unaware of the developing situation, Yablontsev continued throughout the orbit to demonstrate the aircraft's technical functionality, ironically drawing his observer pilot's attention specifically to the TAWS, or Terrain Awareness and Warning System, as well as answering questions relating to aspects of the jet's fuel consumption. In what was to be the cruelest of ironies, as Yablontsev attempted to demonstrate the aircraft's TAWS system, the Sukhoi had coincidentally just completed over half of the intended orbit, and was thus pointing away from the significant terrain to the south. So in effect, there was actually nothing Yablontsev could display on the aircraft's instrumentation to his guest observer sitting just behind his right shoulder. Commenting that there was no problem with terrain at the moment, Yablontsev's guest in the jump seat, acknowledging the predicament, replied, "Yeah, it's flat." Whether this comment in isolation, given the observer pilot's significant local knowledge, would subsequently condition Yablontsev's cognitive model of the environment around him, will be forever conjecture. But given what's about to happen next, one might well suspect that it did. As the Sukhoi rolled out on its final heading of 174 degrees, now believing the aircraft to be better placed for the approach, Yablontsev instructed Kochikov to ask air traffic control for a further right turn in order to position for an approach back onto runway 06. Whether Yablontsev's intentions confused or surprised Kochikov wasn't altogether clear, but what was clear was the fact that over the next several seconds, interaction between the two crew members suggested that at that moment in time there appeared to be no shared perception or understanding of what was about to happen next. With most of the orbit now complete, Yablontsev had obviously intended to take a turn immediately back towards the airport. Yet Korchikov's repeated requests for clarification strongly suggested that he possibly felt that such a move was still somewhat premature. Despite Yablontsev repeatedly stating his desire to make a turn back towards the airport, incredibly, what the cockpit voice recorder highlighted was the fact that neither pilot seemed to really be sure as to where the airport actually was in relation to their aircraft's current position. Whether it was due to congestion on the frequency or perhaps their own preoccupation with resolving the issue for themselves, rather than ask for assistance from air traffic control, instead they procrastinated while trying to interrogate their flight management computer for the answer. The distraction had apparently caused them to lose sight of the fact that the aircraft was no longer orbiting to the right, and having previously rolled out on a heading of 174 degrees, was now heading further to the south and away from the airport. As it did so, the distance between it and the Halim navigation beacon quickly approached and then exceeded the 25 nautical miles, which defined the limit of the MSA for that particular sector. Beyond this 25 nautical mile limit, what had been a minimum safe altitude of 6,900 feet was now immediately replaced by a grid minimum off-route altitude, or MORA, of 13,200. So whereas on completion of the orbit they had been 900 feet below the safe altitude for the area, now having strayed still further south, the aircraft was now an incredible 7,200 feet below the minimum safe altitude, which would have guaranteed terrain clearance across the entire region. And all this while still unable to see anything of the terrain ridge out ahead of them. Nearly 30 seconds had now passed before Yablantsev concluded that the airport actually lay to the northeast of their current position. Believing this to be the case, he again instructed Kochikov to request a right-hand turn in this direction, along with a descent to 1,600 feet, the platform altitude from which he intended to commence the VOR approach to runway 06. As Yablantsev preempted ATC's response, he put the aircraft into a shallow, level turn to the right. Then, almost immediately, the terrain awareness and warning system called out, "Terrain ahead, pull up," followed by a further 6 repetitive avoid terrain warnings over the next 8 seconds. This TAWS system is designed to prevent a CFIT scenario or a case of controlled flight into terrain, by providing the crew with timely alerts based on predicted terrain obstacle clearance profiles, calculated from real-time actual aircraft performance. Essentially, the system is constantly looking ahead of the aircraft for any potential conflict by correlating its projected flight path up to 2 minutes ahead of its current position against an internal terrain elevation database. In a case where this forward-looking calculation identifies that the projected flight path will intersect the terrain directly underlying it, the pilot will be provided with both visual and oral alerts. In the lateral plane, this forward-looking view is deliberately kept narrow, diverging at only 1.5 degrees either side of the projected path, so as to eliminate nuisance alerts from terrain which really would not directly impact on the flight. If the aircraft subsequently enters a turn, this forward-looking function will actually use the aircraft's turn rate to extrapolate terrain conflict detection over the full terrain area underlying the projected turn radius. In response to a pull-up warning, if the system anticipates that the resultant maneuver will be insufficient to clear the terrain directly along the flight path, its software will amend the alert and issue a unique avoid terrain warning so as to advise the crew that, based on the aircraft's current performance, an avoiding turn to the left or right will have to be made in order for terrain separation to be guaranteed. And in the case of the accident flight, this is exactly what happened. Subsequent post-accident analysis conclusively proved that had Yablantsev reacted within 24 seconds of the first TAWS warning, by manoeuvring the Sukhoi at full power in a turning maximum rate of climb, adequate separation with the terrain ridge ahead would have been guaranteed. But alas, history will recall that that isn't what happened. Instead, at 14:32 and 58 seconds, a mere 28 seconds before impact, the cockpit voice recorder picked up on the enunciation of a single chime, while simultaneously the flight data recorder noted the TAWS system going offline. As unlikely as it was, had the TAWS system coincidentally just failed at this most critical juncture? Any suggestion that this might have been the case was immediately dispelled by what the investigation team heard next. As the cockpit voice recording played on, a fraction of a second later, Yablantsev was clearly heard to say, "Maybe it's the database." Perhaps with the observer pilot's previous comment of it being flat still fresh in his memory, Yablantsev had allowed himself to be almost instantaneously biased towards the idea that the aircraft was providing inaccurate information. And so, unbelievably, he had reached up to the panel directly above his head and switched the system off. The Sukhoi's ability to look ahead for potential terrain conflicts had now, in an instant, been rendered completely redundant. The TAWS system had identified a genuine threat and was performing exactly per design, but regrettably, its human master had refused to take these warnings to heart. Yet despite this, the aircraft nonetheless continued to try and warn the flight crew of the imminent danger. Just 7 seconds before impact, as the radio altimeter decreased below 800 feet, sensing the rapidly rising terrain immediately below, the parameters of the aircraft's GPWS Mode 4 were compromised, generating one final alert that the landing gear was not in the extended position for what it erroneously believed was an approach to landing. With the TAWS system now offline, the continued generation of alerts most probably confused and heightened Yablontsev sense of anxiety. His last recorded action was a modest, continuous pitch-up input on a side stick, which lasted for all of 2 seconds. This simultaneously resulted in the forced disconnection of the autopilot, with the jet's nose rising an inconsequential 5 degrees or so. All in all, far too little and far, far too late. The last interaction between the two pilots was recorded at 14:33 and 23 seconds, just 3 seconds before impact, as Kochukov queried Yablontsev as to the cause of the aural alarm which had been generated by the autopilot's disconnection. "What is that?" he was recorded as saying. Yablontsev simply replied, "Autopilot off," before all recordings abruptly stopped 2 seconds later. At a distance of 28 nautical miles from the Hallam VOR navigation beacon, the Sukhoi had impacted a near vertical slope on the northeastern side of Mt.Salak, at an altitude of 6,000 feet, approximately 1,250 feet below the mountain's summit. The force of the impact had instantaneously obliterated the aircraft and taken the lives of all 45 souls on board. Distracted by the sheer volume of traffic she was dealing with at the time, the East Controller only noticed the Sukhoi's absence from her radar screen a full 16.5 minutes later. Over the next 4 minutes, multiple attempts were made to contact the Sukhoi, all without success. Approximately 17.5 hours later, at 8:35 local the following morning, the remains of the Sukhoi were located in the foothills of the very mountain which the local Jakarta Post newspaper had previously dubbed an aircraft graveyard. The Indonesian authorities ultimately concluded that the accident was due firstly to the crew's lack of awareness of the mountainous terrain surrounding their intended flight path, a lack of awareness which resulted in them disregarding a critical warning from the aircraft's terrain awareness and warning system. Secondly, to the fact that the Jakarta radar service had failed to establish both a minimum vectoring altitude and a functioning minimum safe altitude warning system for the specific geographic area surrounding Mt.Salak. And finally, to the crew being distracted for a significant period of time as a result of a prolonged conversation not specifically related to the progress of the flight. In so doing, they had failed to notice the aircraft prematurely roll wings level and exit the orbit on a track which was to take it almost directly south towards the elevated terrain. Although initial reports in the immediate aftermath of the accident suggested that a number of Indonesian carriers had terminated their negotiations with Sukhoi, ultimately these deals were successfully completed. But in truth, the Superjet's reputation never really recovered. 2 further high-profile accidents in 2019 and 2024, along with a litany of customer reliability issues, meant that sales figures have been underwhelming to say the very least, even with domestic Russian operators such as Aeroflot. To add insult to injury, on March 14, 2022, EASA, the European Union's aviation safety agency, revoked the Superjet's airworthiness certificate as part of the EU's sanctions against Russia following the country's invasion of neighbouring Ukraine. Although now banned from European skies, examples of the type still fly internally within Russia, although for how much longer is debatable. Such is the complete story of the Mt.Salak accident of May 9, 2012. An accident which not only killed all those on board, but also metaphorically the reputation of the aircraft which took them there.